In the vast and complex world of Middle-earth, two figures stand out as embodiments of immense power and wisdom: Gandalf the Grey and Sauron, the Dark Lord. Gandalf is often seen as a protector and a guide for the free peoples, yet his deep concern for Sauron's rising power reveals something more profound. Despite Gandalf's formidable abilities, why did he fear Sauron? In this video, we will delve into the intricate relationship between these two powerful beings, explore Gandalf's fears, and understand the reasons behind his relentless opposition to the Dark Lord. Gandalf's fear of Sauron stemmed from the immense power that the Dark Lord wielded, a power far greater than that of any mortal being, or even most of the ancient and wise races of Middle-earth. Both Gandalf and Sauron were Maya, lesser Ainur, divine spirits created by Eru Ilúvatar to serve the greater Valar. This made them beings of immense spiritual and magical strength. However, while Gandalf adhered to the mission given to him by the Valar, one of guidance, wisdom, and indirect influence, Sauron had abandoned any pretense of serving the greater good. Sauron's raw power had evolved beyond that of a mere servant of the world's order. He became an agent of domination, seeking to bend the world and all its inhabitants to his will. Gandalf was deeply aware that Sauron's power was not something that could be confronted through mere physical force. Unlike the powers of men, elves, or even other Ainur like the Balrog, Sauron's strength did not come from brute force alone. His power was insidious, extending across all aspects of Middle-earth, from its political structures to its magical realms, affecting both the physical and metaphysical dimensions. As a Maya who had once served the same divine order as Gandalf, Sauron possessed a depth of power that was almost incomprehensible. Gandalf knew that while he himself had limits placed on his abilities, Sauron had no such restrictions and was free to use his immense strength to corrupt and dominate. Sauron had refined his power through centuries of manipulation and war, becoming a master not only of physical domination, but also of psychological control. His ability to influence the minds and spirits of others, bending them to his will, made him a far greater threat than any mere conqueror. This knowledge weighed heavily on Gandalf, who understood that Sauron was not just a powerful being, he was a force capable of reshaping the very essence of Middle-earth. Gandalf's mission was to prevent this dark future from coming to pass, but he understood that Sauron's power was not something he could directly oppose. His fear was rooted in this realization, that Sauron's power could not be defeated by any one being alone, no matter how strong, and that only through wisdom, strategy, and the unity of the free peoples could they hope to stand against the Dark Lord's influence. Gandalf's concerns about Sauron's military strength were another significant aspect of his fear. Unlike most adversaries, Sauron's forces were not just large or powerful. They were overwhelmingly vast, strategically positioned, and terrifyingly efficient. Sauron had spent millennia building and perfecting his military machine, and by the time of the War of the Ring, his armies were unmatched in size and capability. The sheer number of soldiers under Sauron's command was staggering. His legions of orcs alone numbered in the tens of thousands, and these creatures, bred for war and destruction, were utterly devoted to Sauron. They were tireless, relentless, and brutal, fighting with a ferocity that made them formidable opponents. Unlike the armies of men or elves who fought out of duty, honor, or fear for their homes, Sauron's forces fought out of hatred and fear of their master. The orcs had no sense of self-preservation, no hesitation in battle, and no regard for their own lives. They were perfect soldiers for a Dark Lord bent on the complete domination of Middle-earth. But the orcs were only the tip of the spear. Sauron's military machine also included trolls, massive, nearly indestructible creatures capable of tearing through the ranks of his enemies. These trolls, like the orcs, were twisted versions of their original forms, shaped by Sauron's dark magic to be weapons of war. Additionally, Sauron had enslaved the men of the East and South, who fought for him with a fanaticism born out of promises of wealth, power, and glory. The Easterlings in Haradrim were formidable warriors, skilled in combat, and driven by the belief that Sauron would reward their loyalty by giving them dominion over the lands of the West. Gandalf also feared Sauron's mastery of dark magic, which made him not only a military strategist, but also a sorcerer of immense power. Sauron had the ability to summon storms, spread plagues, and unleash magical forces that could decimate entire armies. His mastery of dark magic meant that even if his enemies could withstand his armies, they would still face the threat of curses, blights, and supernatural destruction. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Sauron's military power was not his armies or his magic, but his strategic mind. Sauron understood warfare on a level unmatched by any of his adversaries. He knew how to exploit the weaknesses of his enemies, how to divide them, and how to wear them down over time. His strategy was not to engage his enemies in a single decisive battle, but to slowly grind them down, exhausting their resources and morale until they had no choice but to submit. Gandalf recognized that Sauron's ability to wage psychological warfare was just as dangerous as his physical armies. The mere threat of Sauron's return was enough to cause panic and disarray among his enemies. His influence spread fear like a shadow, paralyzing resistance before the battle had even begun. In addition to his overwhelming military power, Sauron was a master of psychological warfare. This aspect of his dominion was perhaps even more terrifying than the legions of orcs and trolls at his command. Sauron's ability to manipulate the minds and wills of others, spreading fear, despair, and corruption, made him a nearly unstoppable force. Gandalf feared Sauron's influence over the hearts and minds of the free peoples because it threatened to unravel their resistance from within. Sauron's psychological warfare operated on multiple levels. First, he used fear as a weapon. The mere mention of his name, the sight of the black land of Mordor on the horizon, and the ever-present shadow of his eye were enough to cause terror and despair among the free peoples. Fear paralyzed them, making it difficult for them to organize, plan, or even fight. Gandalf knew that fear could be as destructive as any sword or spell. It sapped the courage and will of even the bravest warriors, causing them to hesitate, doubt, and eventually fall into despair. Beyond fear, Sauron also used deceit and manipulation to turn his enemies against one another. He spread lies, rumors, and false information, sowing discord among the free peoples. Sauron had a deep understanding of the weaknesses of men, elves, and dwarves. He knew how to exploit their fears, ambitions, and insecurities. By playing on these vulnerabilities, he could cause factions to fight amongst themselves rather than uniting against him. Gandalf feared this subtle form of manipulation because it was often invisible until it was too late. Sauron's influence could reach into the highest councils of men and elves, corrupting leaders and heroes, making them serve his purposes without even realizing it. Gandalf's fear of Sauron's psychological influence was heightened by the knowledge that even those who resisted Sauron's armies could be broken from within. Sauron did not need to conquer his enemies physically to defeat them. He could dominate their wills, making them his servants in all but name. Those who stood against Sauron risked losing not only their lives, but their very selves. becoming twisted versions of who they once were, enslaved to his will. Sauron's psychological manipulation extended not only to individuals, but to entire nations. Through his agents and servants, he spread fear and lies, weakening the resolve of kingdoms like Gondor and Rohan. He used division as a weapon, knowing that a fractured enemy was easier to conquer. Gandalf understood that Sauron's power lay not only in his armies, but in his ability to exploit the weaknesses of the free peoples, turning them against each other and themselves. This was a battle fought not just on the field, but in the hearts and minds of Middle-earth's inhabitants. Gandalf's fear of Sauron was rooted not only in the power Sauron held, but also in the memories of what he had witnessed in ages past. During the Second Age, Sauron's rise to power had caused devastation on an unprecedented scale, and Gandalf, though not physically present for all of it, knew well the consequences of Sauron's unchecked ambition. The fall of Numenor, one of the mightiest civilizations of men, had been orchestrated by Sauron's deception. The island kingdom, once a beacon of power and wisdom, was corrupted by Sauron's influence, leading its people to attack the Valar themselves in a misguided quest for immortality. Numenor was destroyed, sunk beneath the waves, and this cataclysmic event was a testament to Sauron's ability to destroy even the greatest of civilizations through manipulation and deceit. Gandalf also remembered the fall of Eregion, the elven kingdom where the rings of power were forged. Sauron, in his guise as Anatar, had manipulated the elves into creating the rings, only to forge the one ring in secret, binding the others to his will. This act of betrayal led to the downfall of Eregion and the loss of many great elven lives. Gandalf knew that Sauron's treachery had not ended with the creation of the rings. It was a recurring theme in his rise to power. The destruction of Eregion was a reminder that even the wisest and most powerful beings could be deceived by Sauron's cunning. The corruption of the men of the East and South, who had once been noble allies of Numenor, was another painful lesson. Sauron had manipulated these people, turning them into his loyal servants. They fought for him not out of love for his cause, but because they had been deceived into believing that serving Sauron would bring them glory and wealth. These men, who could have been great allies of the free peoples, were now some of Sauron's most devoted followers, proof of his ability to corrupt entire nations. Gandalf knew that Sauron's history was filled with examples of his power to destroy through manipulation and corruption, and this weighed heavily on him as he sought to prevent Sauron's return to full strength. He understood that Sauron's strength lay not only in his armies, but in his ability to corrupt and twist the minds and hearts of even the most noble beings. Sauron's rise in the Second Age was a clear warning of what could happen if he were allowed to regain his power, and Gandalf feared that history might repeat itself if Sauron was not stopped. In addition to his military might and dark magic, Sauron had another terrifying advantage: his control over nature and reality itself. As a Maya, Sauron had vast power over the elements of the physical world, a power that he used to devastating effect in his quest for domination. Gandalf understood that Sauron's ability to manipulate the very fabric of Middle-earth made him an opponent unlike any other. His control extended beyond armies and magic. It reached into the forces of nature itself. Sauron's ability to manipulate the elements gave him a godlike presence in Middle-earth. He could summon storms, create earthquakes, and unleash plagues that would ravage entire populations. These natural disasters were not merely acts of destruction, but were expressions of Sauron's will. He used the forces of nature as weapons, bending them to his dark purposes. Gandalf feared that no army, no matter how strong, could stand against Sauron's ability to reshape the world itself. This was a level of power that few could even comprehend, let alone resist. Sauron's control over time and space was perhaps his most subtle and terrifying ability. As a Maya, he had a deep understanding of the flow of time, and while he could not directly alter it, he could manipulate it in subtle ways. He could create areas of Middle-earth where time flowed differently, where the natural order was bent to his will. Gandalf knew that this manipulation of reality itself made Sauron a nearly invincible foe. Even the most well-planned strategies could be undone if Sauron chose to bend the rules of nature in his favor. Gandalf's fear of Sauron's metaphysical power was rooted in the knowledge that no army or alliance could hope to match Sauron's control over the elements. To defeat Sauron, Gandalf knew, would require more than military strength. It would require a deep understanding of the forces of nature and the metaphysical balance of Middle-earth. Sauron's power was not just about physical domination, it was about reshaping the world according to his vision. And this made him a threat to the very essence of Middle-earth. One of the most dangerous aspects of Sauron's power was his unparalleled skill in deception. Throughout his long existence, Sauron had honed the ability to manipulate, deceive, and corrupt even the wisest and most powerful beings. Gandalf's fear of Sauron was in part rooted in the Dark Lord's ability to use deceit as a weapon, a tool that was often more effective than any sword or spell. Sauron's most infamous act of deception was the creation of the Rings of Power. Disguised as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, Sauron approached the elves of Eregion with promises of knowledge and wisdom. Under his guidance, the elven smiths, led by Celebrimbor, forged the Rings of Power, believing they were creating tools for the betterment of Middle-earth. However, Sauron secretly forged the One Ring, a master ring that would control all the others. This act of treachery was the pinnacle of Sauron's skill in deception. While the elves believed they were creating something for good, they were, in fact, falling into Sauron's trap, binding themselves to his will through the power of the One Ring. Gandalf understood the depth of this betrayal and what it signified about Sauron's ability to manipulate even the most powerful beings. The elves were among the wisest and most knowledgeable of all the free peoples, and if they could be deceived, then no one was safe from Sauron's schemes. Gandalf feared that Sauron's influence could reach into the minds of leaders and heroes, turning them against one another and against themselves. This fear was not unfounded. Gandalf had seen how Sauron's manipulations had caused the fall of Saruman, one of Gandalf's own kind, and the most powerful of the Astari. Saruman, believing he could wield Sauron's power for good, was ultimately corrupted by it, becoming Sauron's pawn. This betrayal was a stark reminder that even the most powerful beings could be twisted by Sauron's influence, and Gandalf knew that many others could fall into the same trap if they were not vigilant. Sauron's ability to manipulate extended beyond individuals to entire peoples and nations. Through his agents and spies, he spread lies, fear, and misinformation, stoking the flames of war between the various factions of Middle-earth. The men of the East and South had already fallen under Sauron's sway, believing his lies about power and dominance. Even among the free peoples, distrust and discord were rampant, and Gandalf feared that Sauron could exploit these divisions to devastating effect. Sauron's skill in manipulation was not limited to grand acts of deception like the creation of the rings or the fall of Saruman. He was also a master of subtle influence, using fear, greed, and ambition to corrupt those who might otherwise resist him. Gandalf knew that Sauron's influence was insidious, working slowly over time to erode the will of his enemies. This gradual subjugation of minds was one of the most dangerous aspects of Sauron's power, and Gandalf feared that even those who sought to oppose Sauron could be unwittingly manipulated into serving his purposes. At the center of Gandalf's fear of Sauron was the One Ring, the most powerful of Sauron's tools of domination and the key to his ability to control the other rings of power. The ring was more than just an object of great magical power. It was the embodiment of Sauron's will, a tool of corruption and control that had the potential to warp the hearts and minds of those who came into contact with it. Gandalf's fear of the ring was not just about what it could do in Sauron's hands, but also about the effect it had on those who sought to wield it. The ring's corrupting influence was subtle but devastating, working over time to twist the desires and intentions of its bearer. Even those who began with the best of intentions, believing they could use the ring for good, were slowly turned to evil by its power. The ring fed on ambition, pride, and fear, and Gandalf knew that no one was immune to its influence, not even the most powerful or wise. This was one of Gandalf's deepest fears, that even the strongest defenders of Middle-earth could be undone by the ring's seductive promise of power. The danger of the ring was not just in its ability to corrupt individuals, but in its ability to change the course of events on a grand scale. Those who sought to use the ring, believing they could wield its power to defeat Sauron, would inevitably fall into his trap. The ring had a will of its own, aligned with Sauron's desires, and it would work to reunite with its master at any cost. Gandalf understood that the ring could not be controlled by anyone other than Sauron. To attempt to use it was to risk becoming Sauron's servant, no matter the original intentions. This realization weighed heavily on Gandalf, as he knew that even he, if he took the ring, would become a tyrant, perhaps even worse than Sauron. The ring amplified the powers of its bearer, but it also twisted those powers to serve darkness. Gandalf's fear of the ring was deeply personal, as he recognized that the power it offered was too great for anyone to wield without succumbing to its influence. Gandalf's fear of the One Ring also extended to its influence over others. Even those who did not bear the ring could be affected by its presence. The Fellowship of the Ring itself was nearly torn apart by the power of the ring, as Boromir's desire for it led him to betray his comrades. The ring spread fear, greed, and suspicion among those who were near it, weakening the forces of good and making them more vulnerable to Sauron's attacks. Gandalf knew that as long as the ring existed, it would continue to cause strife and division, weakening the resistance against Sauron. The only solution was to destroy it. But this task seemed nearly impossible. The ring had a will of its own, and it actively sought to survive, working to reunite with Sauron. Destroying the ring would require an act of great courage and sacrifice, and Gandalf feared that even the smallest misstep could lead to disaster. Gandalf's fear of Sauron was deeply tied to his understanding of the fragility of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Though men, elves, dwarves, and hobbits were capable of great deeds, they were also prone to division, mistrust, and internal strife. Sauron had always sought to exploit these weaknesses, knowing that a divided enemy was far easier to conquer. Gandalf's greatest fear was that the free peoples, lacking unity and resilience, would crumble under the weight of Sauron's growing power. One of the major problems Gandalf faced was the isolation of the different races. The elves, once the dominant force in Middle-earth, were fading. Many had already sailed to the Undying Lands, and those who remained were focused on their own concerns. Rivendell and Lothlorien, the last bastions of elven power, were isolated strongholds far removed from the affairs of men and dwarves. The elves had become reclusive, their immortal perspective leading them to withdraw from the world's struggles. Gandalf feared that their reluctance to fully involve themselves in the fight against Sauron would leave the Free Peoples without their most ancient and powerful allies when they were most needed. The dwarves, too, were focused on their own survival and the reclamation of their lost kingdoms. Dwarven societies, like those of Erebor and the Iron Hills, were hardy and resilient, but they were also insular, driven by their own concerns over wealth and territory. Their strained relationship with the elves added another layer of difficulty. Gandalf knew that the long history of mistrust between these two peoples, going back to the feud over the treasures of Erebor and the murder of King Thingol over a Silmaril, would be a major obstacle to uniting the Free Peoples. Sauron would have no difficulty exploiting this deep-seated enmity, turning potential allies into rivals. Gandalf feared that unless the dwarves could be convinced to see the larger picture, their isolation would leave Middle-earth even more vulnerable to Sauron's conquest. Men, despite their potential for greatness, were among the most vulnerable to Sauron's influence. Unlike elves or dwarves, men were easily swayed by promises of power and wealth, and many had already fallen under Sauron's sway. The Easterlings and Southrons had long been allies of the Dark Lord, corrupted by his promises of dominion. Gondor, once the greatest kingdom of men, was a shadow of its former self, weakened by centuries of warfare and internal strife. The stewards of Gondor had ruled in the absence of a king, but their power had waned, and the shadow of Mordor loomed ever closer. Rohan, Gondor's closest ally, was also struggling with its own internal conflicts as the kingdom was beset by Saruman's treachery and the manipulations of Wormtongue. Gandalf knew that unless these kingdoms of men could find their strength and unity, they would be easy prey for Sauron's armies. Gandalf's understanding of the fragility of men was deepened by his awareness of their mortality. Unlike the immortal elves or the long-lived dwarves, men were short-lived and often acted in haste, driven by fear or ambition. Sauron could exploit these very human traits, using the fear of death to turn even noble men toward darkness. Gandalf had already seen this in Numenor, where Sauron had convinced the Númenóreans to seek immortality by attacking the Valar, leading to the island's destruction. He feared that the lure of power and the fear of mortality could once again drive men to make reckless decisions, weakening their resistance against Sauron. The hobbits, while not a major military force, represented another vulnerability. Gandalf cared deeply for the Shire and its inhabitants, recognizing in them a purity and resilience that was lacking in the other races. However, he also understood that the hobbits were incredibly vulnerable to outside forces. The Shire was protected only by its isolation and its relative obscurity, but if Sauron's influence reached that far, the hobbits would have no means of defending themselves. Gandalf feared for the Shire not just because of the physical threat Sauron posed, but because even the most innocent and peaceful of places could be corrupted by the shadow of the Dark Lord. In addition to these internal weaknesses, the Free Peoples were up against a foe whose strategic mind was unmatched. Sauron was an ancient being with a deep understanding of the weaknesses of men, elves, and dwarves, and he had been working for centuries to exploit those weaknesses. He knew how to sow division and mistrust, how to play on fears and ambitions, and how to turn allies against each other. Gandalf feared that without unity and a common purpose, the Free Peoples would be powerless against Sauron's cunning. Gandalf's role, then, was not only to lead the fight against Sauron, but to hold the fragile alliance of the Free Peoples together. He understood that their only chance of victory lay in their ability to put aside their differences and work together. This was a daunting task, as the history of Middle-earth was full of old wounds and grudges that could easily be reignited. Gandalf feared that even a small misstep could cause the alliance to crumble, leaving Middle-earth defenseless against the overwhelming might of Mordor. Sauron's military power was another reason Gandalf feared him so deeply. While Sauron's personal strength and his ability to manipulate and corrupt were terrifying in their own right, the Dark Lord's ability to command vast armies posed a direct and overwhelming threat to the free peoples of Middle-earth. Gandalf knew that Sauron's armies were unlike anything the free peoples had ever faced. They were vast, ruthless, and bred for war, driven by a relentless will to destroy and conquer. These armies would be key in Sauron's strategy to dominate Middle-earth, and Gandalf feared that even the combined forces of men, elves, and dwarves might not be enough to withstand them. Sauron's armies were not just large in number, they were strategically crafted to cover every possible front of the war. The orcs, his primary soldiers, were bred in the deep pits of Mordor and the surrounding lands. These creatures, twisted and corrupt, were fanatically loyal to Sauron and were driven by fear and hatred. They were well organized, and their numbers seemed limitless, pouring out of the Black Gates in wave after wave. The orcs had no fear of death, and they fought with a brutality that made them terrifying opponents on the battlefield. Gandalf knew that this unyielding force, combined with Sauron's tactical genius, could easily overwhelm the defenses of Gondor, Rohan, and the other free nations if left unchecked. But orcs were only one part of Sauron's military machine. The Dark Lord commanded legions of trolls, great beasts bred for war and destruction. These towering creatures were nearly impervious to conventional weapons and could crush entire battalions with their sheer strength. Sauron had also enslaved the wild men of the east and south, the Easterlings and the Haradrim, who rode into battle on giant oliphants and brought their own distinct martial traditions to bear. These men fought not only for fear of Sauron, but also because they had been promised great rewards in the new world he intended to build, a world in which they would have dominion over the western lands. In addition to the physical might of his forces, Sauron was a master strategist. He understood the art of war at a level unmatched by any in Middle-earth, save perhaps Gandalf and the other Istari. Sauron's strategy was multifaceted, designed to spread his enemies thin and exhaust their resources. He had his orcish legions raid and harass Gondor's borders constantly, wearing down the kingdom's defenses over time. He also used spies and agents, such as the Mouth of Sauron and the Nazgul, to spread fear and misinformation, further weakening the resolve of his enemies. His ability to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies without even engaging them in battle was a critical part of his military strategy, and Gandalf feared that this psychological warfare could be just as damaging as the physical battles. Gandalf also knew that Sauron's ultimate plan was not to engage his enemies in a single, decisive battle, but to grind them down slowly over time. Sauron had the advantage of being nearly immortal, and he could afford to wait, weakening his enemies gradually while his own power grew. He had no need to rush. His armies would continue to grow, and his influence would spread ever further. Gandalf, on the other hand, knew that the free peoples did not have the luxury of time. They were already stretched thin, and every passing day brought them closer to the point of collapse. The Nazgul, Sauron's most feared servants, were another critical element of his military strategy. These 9 ring-wraiths were former kings of men who had been enslaved by Sauron through the power of their rings. Now, undead, They served as his most powerful and terrifying lieutenants. The Nazgul were not only fearsome warriors, but they also carried with them an aura of dread that could paralyze entire armies. Their mere presence on the battlefield could cause panic and confusion, weakening the resolve of even the bravest soldiers. Gandalf feared that the Nazgul, particularly their leader, the Witch King of Angmar, could turn the tide of battle in Sauron's favor. Sauron's military might was further reinforced by the fortifications he had built across Middle-earth. The Black Gate of Mordor, the towers of Barad-dûr, and the fortresses of Minas Morgul and Cirith Ungol were nearly impregnable, built to withstand any assault. These strongholds allowed Sauron to control the key regions of Middle-earth and ensured that his armies had safe havens from which to launch their attacks. Gandalf knew that any attempt to besiege these fortresses would be a costly and dangerous endeavor, one that the free peoples might not survive. In the face of such overwhelming military power, Gandalf feared that even the combined forces of Middle-earth would not be enough to stop Sauron. He understood that they were not just fighting against soldiers and fortresses, but against a mind that had planned for every contingency. Sauron's army was not merely a collection of forces. It was a meticulously crafted instrument of domination, designed to bring about the end of the free peoples through sheer attrition and relentless assault. Ultimately, Gandalf's fear of Sauron's military power was rooted in the knowledge that Sauron had the advantage in every aspect of warfare. His armies were vast, his strategy impeccable, and his control over the battlefield absolute. Gandalf knew that defeating Sauron would require more than just strength of arms. It would require cunning, sacrifice, and a deep understanding of the Dark Lord's methods. At the heart of Gandalf's fear of Sauron was the understanding that their conflict went far beyond a simple struggle between good and evil, or even a contest for dominion over Middle-earth. Gandalf and Sauron were both Maya, lesser spirits created by the supreme deity Eru Ilúvatar to serve the greater Valar in shaping and guiding the world. This deeper spiritual dimension to their existence meant that their conflict was not just material, but metaphysical, involving the balance of forces within the world itself. Gandalf feared that Sauron's ambition and power, if unchecked, would upset the delicate balance established by the Valar, plunging all of Middle-earth into an era of darkness and despair. Gandalf was sent to Middle-earth as one of the 5 Istari, or wizards, by the Valar themselves. His mission was not to rule, but to guide and inspire the free peoples in their resistance against Sauron. The Valar had specifically restricted the Istari from using their full divine powers, lest they become tyrants themselves. This limitation weighed heavily on Gandalf, as he was acutely aware that Sauron had no such restraints. Sauron, too, had once been a Maya in service to the Valar, but he had chosen the path of rebellion, following Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. Unlike Gandalf, Sauron had embraced the full use of his Maya power in the pursuit of domination. This made the battle between them inherently unequal in terms of raw power, and Gandalf had to rely on wisdom, subtlety, and alliances, rather than overwhelming force, to counter Sauron. The cosmic nature of this conflict added another layer to Gandalf's fear. Sauron, like Morgoth before him, sought to remake Middle-earth in his own image, using his power to bend the natural order of things to his will. Gandalf understood that Sauron's victory would mean more than just the defeat of the free peoples. It would mean the perversion of the world's inherent harmony. The beauty and diversity of Middle-earth, its free will and natural cycles, would be corrupted into a nightmarish vision of order imposed through tyranny. Everything from the lands and rivers to the hearts and minds of its inhabitants would fall under Sauron's control, turning Middle-earth into a twisted reflection of his dark desires. Gandalf's fear was also informed by his awareness of the history of the Valar and Maiar. He had seen how Morgoth's rebellion in the First Age had caused immense suffering and destruction, leading to the sundering of the world and the loss of many of the great kingdoms of old. Morgoth's fall had resulted in a world permanently scarred by his evil, and Gandalf knew that Sauron's rise could lead to an even greater catastrophe. Sauron, while not as powerful as Morgoth, had learned from his master's mistakes. He was more patient, more cunning, and more willing to use the subtler tools of manipulation and corruption to achieve his goals. Gandalf feared that Sauron's brand of evil, while less overtly destructive, might ultimately be more enduring and insidious. Moreover, Gandalf was aware of the broader cosmic implications of his struggle with Sauron. The Valar, though powerful, had largely withdrawn from direct intervention in Middle-earth, leaving its fate in the hands of the Free Peoples. Gandalf, as their emissary, carried the weight of this responsibility on his shoulders. If he failed to stop Sauron, it would not only mean the loss of Middle-earth to darkness, but it might also signal a greater imbalance in the world's spiritual fabric, one that could ripple across time and space, affecting all creation. This existential dread haunted Gandalf, driving him to act with caution and wisdom in every decision he made. The concept of balance also applied to Gandalf's own internal struggle. As a Maia, he had immense potential for both good and evil. Gandalf understood that his role as a guide was crucial because he could easily become a figure of domination himself if he allowed power to corrupt him, much as it had corrupted Saruman. This fear of becoming like Sauron, of tipping the scales too far in the opposite direction, kept Gandalf grounded. He knew that his power was not to be used recklessly, and that his mission was one of fostering free will, not forcing his will upon others. This delicate balance between action and restraint was something Sauron had long abandoned, making their conflict not only a battle of strength, but also a battle of principles. Gandalf's ultimate fear was that the balance of the world would be forever broken if Sauron were victorious. Middle-earth was not just a physical realm, but a reflection of the larger cosmic order. If Sauron succeeded in bending it to his will, it would set a dangerous precedent that evil could dominate creation without consequence. Gandalf, understanding the spiritual dimensions of his task, knew that the stakes were not just the survival of the Free Peoples, but the preservation of the very nature of the world as it was intended by Ilúvatar and the Valar. One of the deepest sources of Gandalf's fear was his acute awareness of his own limitations. While he was a Maia, a being of great spiritual and magical power, he had been sent to Middle-earth in the guise of an old man with strict constraints on his abilities. His task was not to rule or directly combat Sauron, but to inspire and guide the Free Peoples in their resistance. This limitation often frustrated Gandalf, as he knew that Sauron too was a Maia, yet Sauron had fully embraced his power and used it to dominate others. Gandalf's fear stemmed from the knowledge that, in a direct confrontation, he could not match Sauron's raw power without violating the very principles that guided his mission. Gandalf's greatest limitation was the role imposed upon him by the Valar. He was not permitted to directly oppose Sauron with all his strength. His task was to work within the boundaries of Middle-earth's mortal inhabitants. This meant that he had to rely on persuasion, diplomacy, and subtle interventions rather than overwhelming force. Gandalf's fear arose from the knowledge that his actions might not be enough to counter Sauron's might. He could advise and assist, but ultimately the free peoples had to fight their own battles. Gandalf could not simply confront Sauron and end the threat himself. That power was beyond him, or rather, beyond what he was allowed to do. This limitation forced Gandalf to operate in the shadows, guiding individuals and events without ever taking center stage. He had to trust in the abilities and decisions of mortals, creatures far weaker and more fallible than himself. This trust was not always easy to maintain, as Gandalf saw the many ways in which mortals could be swayed by fear, ambition, or ignorance. He feared that no matter how much he helped, they might falter at the critical moment. The fate of Middle-earth rested in the hands of beings who were often short-sighted, vulnerable to corruption, and subject to the lure of power. Gandalf knew that he could only do so much to steer them in the right direction, and this lack of control filled him with anxiety. One of Gandalf's personal fears was the risk of failure through overreach. He had seen Saruman, another of the Istari, fall into the trap of seeking power for himself, convinced that he could wield it for good. Saruman's descent into treachery and his alliance with Sauron was a constant reminder to Gandalf of the fine line between guidance and domination. He feared that if he allowed himself to be tempted by the desire to control events directly, he could fall into the same trap. Gandalf understood that power, even when used with good intentions, could corrupt, and he was terrified of becoming another Saruman, someone who, in trying to defeat evil, became a tool of that very evil. Gandalf also recognized that his mortality in Middle-earth posed another limitation. Though he was a Maya in essence, his form as an old man was susceptible to physical harm and exhaustion. He could be wounded, as he was in his battle with the Balrog, and he could be killed, as his temporary death in Moria demonstrated. This mortality was a constant reminder that, while he was powerful, he was not invincible. Gandalf feared that his physical limitations might prevent him from being there when he was most needed. His role in the war against Sauron required him to be present at critical moments, and the possibility that he might not survive long enough to see the task through was a source of great anxiety. Another limitation Gandalf wrestled with was his ability to foresee the future. While he had great wisdom and insight, he was not omniscient. He could not predict every move Sauron would make, nor could he foresee all the twists and turns the war would take. This uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Gandalf feared that, despite his best efforts, he might miscalculate or make a wrong decision at a crucial moment, leading to disaster. His guidance to the free peoples, while wise, was not infallible, and the fear of making a fatal mistake haunted him. Perhaps most personally, Gandalf feared the weight of responsibility that rested upon him. Though his mission was to guide, not to rule, he knew that many looked to him as a leader, especially in the darkest moments of the struggle against Sauron. Gandalf was often seen as the one with all the answers, the one who would bring light in times of shadow. This expectation was a heavy burden, and Gandalf feared that he might not live up to it. He was aware that despite his efforts, victory was not guaranteed, and failure would mean the end of everything he had worked to protect. The fear of letting down those who trusted him, and of being unable to stop the coming darkness, weighed on him constantly. Ultimately, Gandalf's fear of his own limitations was not rooted in a lack of confidence, but in a deep understanding of the stakes involved. He knew that his mission was not just a matter of defeating Sauron in battle, but of preserving the freedom and diversity of Middle-earth. His fear drove him to act with great care, always mindful of the delicate balance between power and wisdom, force and restraint. It was this fear that made Gandalf such a formidable figure, for he understood that true power lay not in domination, but in the ability to inspire others to find their own strength.